Of all Egypt's pyramids, one looks wrong. The others rise in clean, confident lines. Geometry carried to its limit, stone meeting sky without apology. But south of Cairo, in the royal necropolis of Dahshur, stands a pyramid that changes its mind halfway up. Its lower half surges sharply toward the sky, steep, bold, almost aggressive. Then it bends. The angle softens. The silhouette shifts. The pyramid does something no pyramid is supposed to do. For 4,600 years, travellers have stopped at Dahshur and stared at this structure, uncertain what they were seeing. A mistake? An optical illusion? A deliberate artistic choice by builders who gave the world some of history's most precise monuments? The real answer is more unsettling than any of those. Yet the pyramid may have been bending towards collapse, and the builders knew it. The bent pyramid stands at Dahshur, raised during the reign of Sneferu, one of ancient Egypt's most relentless builders, and the father of the pharaoh who would one day commission the Great Pyramid of Giza. Sneferu built on a scale that no ruler before him had attempted. Records attribute to him not one, not two, but at least 3 major pyramids over the course of a single reign. A construction program so vast that it consumed more stone than any other pharaoh in Egyptian history. But the Great Pyramid did not arrive fully formed. Before Khufu's engineers achieved geometric perfection at Giza, before the right angles were accurate to within a fraction of a degree, before a structure rose that would stand as the largest building on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, there was this. There was the bent pyramid. And unlike the monuments that followed it, this one carries a visible scar. Structural surveys conducted with modern imaging technology have identified stress fractures inside the pyramid's inner chambers. The lower passages show signs of compression damage. The upper burial chamber was built with a corbelled ceiling. Each layer of stone stepped inward to redistribute weight, a technique that speaks not of artistic ambition, but of structural anxiety. This pyramid was not just built, it was corrected. Somewhere around 49 metres into its ascent, the original angle of 54 degrees was abandoned. The builders dropped to 43 degrees. The upper section is shallower, lighter, and structurally safer than the lower half. And the junction between the two is visible from kilometres away. That visible bend is not decoration. It is a record. It is the moment, frozen in limestone, when the engineers of ancient Egypt looked at what they had built and made a decision that had never been made before at this scale. Change it or risk losing everything. The question is not simply why the pyramid bends. The question is what happened inside those chambers, on those ramps, among those engineers, around 4,600 years ago, that made them stop, recalculate, and rebuild in real time. And what does it reveal about the people who, one generation later, built the last surviving wonder of the ancient world? The bent pyramid was a beginning disguised as a problem, which raises a question worth sitting with. How many things in your own life look like failures from the outside and are actually the thing that makes everything after them possible? Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories told this way. There are plenty of them buried under 4,000 years of assumption. To answer that, we have to go back, not just to Sneferu, but to the long experimental road that led to Dahshur in the first place. Sneferu did not build like a man who was afraid. He built like a man who intended to outlast time itself, and for most of his reign the stone obeyed him. But at Dahshur, something happened that no pharaoh's ambition could simply command away. The engineers who served him, the finest architectural minds of the ancient world, found themselves facing a problem that had no precedent, no manual, and no margin for error. What they did next would quietly determine the fate of every major pyramid that followed. The Dashur necropolis sits on the edge of the desert, roughly 40 kilometers south of what is now Cairo. In Sneferu's time, it was chosen as royal ground, elevated, ceremonial, and vast enough to accommodate a building program of extraordinary scale. This was not a site for modest ambitions. The landscape around it still communicates that clearly. Even today, the bent pyramid is visible from a distance that makes its proportions difficult to mentally process. A mountain of dressed limestone rising from flat desert with no gradual approach, no preparation. It simply appears. And then, if you look long enough, you notice the bend. Sneferu's legacy in stone is without parallel among Egyptian rulers, while chronologies indicate he commissioned more pyramid construction than any other pharaoh, before or after. His building program consumed an estimated 3.5 million cubic meters of stone. For context, that figure exceeds the volume of his son Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza, the structure that would eventually become the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. The Great Pyramid is where Egyptian pyramid building ends, in its most refined form. Giza is the destination. Dashur is where the road was still being built, and where it nearly washed out entirely. The bent pyramid was designed with a base angle of 54 degrees. That is steep, steeper than any pyramid that would be successfully completed after it. The geometry was ambitious by intention. Sneferu's builders were not working from a conservative playbook. They were attempting something that had never been done at this scale, a true smooth-sided pyramid, its faces unbroken from base to apex, its profile a clean triangle against the desert sky. That vision held until, at roughly 49 meters into the ascent, it didn't. The angle drops to 43 degrees. The upper section is shallower, the load it places on the structure below it measurably reduced. The transition is not subtle, it is not artistic, it is the kind of change that happens when engineers are no longer designing for beauty and are designing purely for survival. 3 questions follow from that visible shift, and they have occupied archaeologists, structural engineers, and historians for generations. Why did the angle change? The geometry of pyramid construction is not arbitrary. Every degree of incline represents a calculation about weight, pressure, and the behaviour of millions of limestone blocks under their own compounded mass. A mid-construction correction of this magnitude does not happen without cause. Did the builders detect active structural failure? Inscriptions from this period are silent on the internal crisis, but the stones themselves are not. Modern surveys have located the evidence, and it points toward a pyramid that was communicating distress while still being built. And what does this moment reveal about how Egyptian builders actually thought? Not in mythology, not in ceremony, but in the hard, consequential language of engineering under pressure. Those questions will be answered, one layer at a time, but before any of them can be properly addressed, one thing must be established clearly. The bent pyramid is not a monument that failed. It is a monument that was afraid and held. That distinction matters enormously, because the fear that bent this pyramid is the same force that 1 generation later produced the most precisely constructed building in the ancient world. The story of how that happened begins long before Sneferu ever broke ground at Dashur. The bent pyramid did not emerge from nowhere. It was the product of nearly 2 centuries of accumulated ambition, a long chain of architectural decisions, each one bolder than the last, each one pushing stone and mathematics closer to a limit that no one had yet defined. To understand what went wrong at Dahshur, you have to understand what came before it, because the crisis at the bent pyramid was not a sudden shock. It was the inevitable consequence of a civilization moving faster than its own knowledge could safely carry it. The earliest royal tombs in Egypt were not pyramids at all. They were mastabas, low, flat-roofed rectangular structures made of mud brick, then later of stone. Functional and solid, they sat close to the ground, their weight distributed across a broad base. They were not built to reach the sky. They were built to endure. And in that conservative ambition, they succeeded. Several survive to this day, but around 2650 years BC, something changed. A pharaoh named Djoser commissioned a monument at Saqqara that would redefine what stone could be asked to do. His architect, a man named Imhotep, who would later be deified for his intellect, stacked mastaba upon mastaba in progressively smaller tiers, producing the world's first large-scale stone structure built to ascend. The result was the step pyramid, 6 layers rising to a height of approximately 60 meters, a staircase built for eternity. It was an extraordinary leap, but it was still structurally a series of stacked platforms. The outward pressure of each layer was contained by the layer beneath it. The geometry was forgiving. The engineering, while innovative, had a built-in margin of safety. The ambition that followed would not be so cautious. After Djoser, Egyptian builders began pushing toward something more refined, a pyramid with smooth, unbroken faces. The step profile was powerful, but the true geometric pyramid, with its clean triangular silhouette, represented a higher mathematical ideal. Achieving it required a fundamental change in construction approach, and instead of stacking inward-leaning tiers, builders had to think about continuous casing, smooth outer stones laid against a core, all of it rising at a consistent angle from base to apex. That transition introduced a structural problem that mastabas and step pyramids had never fully encountered. The steeper the angle, the greater the outward thrust on the lower courses. A smooth-sided pyramid is not simply a step pyramid with the gaps filled in. It behaves differently under its own weight. The forces it generates press outward as much as downward, and at monumental scale, that lateral pressure becomes enormous. No one had yet built a smooth-sided pyramid large enough to discover exactly how enormous. That discovery may have come at Meidum. Roughly 90 kilometers south of Cairo stands a structure that today looks less like a pyramid, and more like a tower rising from a mountain of its own rubble. The Meidum Pyramid, begun, records suggest, under a predecessor of Sneferu, and quite possibly continued under Sneferu himself, partially collapsed at some point in antiquity. The outer casing fell away. The lower courses gave out. What remains is a stark monument to the consequences of miscalculation. Layers of debris still surround its base. The failure is not subtle, and here is what makes Sneferu's story remarkable and sobering. By the time his builders broke ground at Dahshur, there was already evidence that smooth-sided construction at scale was genuinely dangerous. The Meidum disaster was not a rumour, it was visible, documented in stone and rubble. Sneferu pressed forward anyway. Not once, not twice. His reign produced multiple major pyramid projects, each one an experiment in pushing the boundaries further than the last. The Bent Pyramid was not Sneferu's first gamble with architectural ambition. It was simply the one where the stone pushed back hardest. Every pyramid begins as a decision about angle. That choice, made on papyrus or in sand or in the mind of a master builder before a single stone was placed, determines everything that follows. It sets the pyramid's height relative to its base. It determines how much stone will be needed, how long construction will take, and most critically, how much pressure the lower courses will be required to absorb as the structure climbs. Get it right, and the pyramid rises cleanly, holds its geometry, and endures. Get it wrong, and the consequences are not abstract. They are measured in fractured stone, collapsing corridors, and the kind of failure that echoes across centuries. At Dashur, Sneferu's engineers chose 54 degrees. To appreciate what that number means structurally, it helps to understand what pyramid builders were actually managing when they chose a slope. A pyramid is not simply a pile of stone arranged in a triangle. It is a system under continuous internal stress. Every block placed above the foundation increases the compressive load on everything beneath it, and at steep angles that load does not press straight down. It presses outward. The steeper the incline, the more aggressively the structure tries to spread at its base, pushing the lower courses apart with forces that increase exponentially as height accumulates. Later, pyramid builders, informed as we will see by hard experience, settled on angles closer to 52 degrees at Giza and 43 degrees at the Red Pyramid. Those shallower profiles reduced lateral thrust dramatically. They were not aesthetically safer choices. They were structurally necessary ones. 54 degrees sits well above that threshold. It is the angle of a builder who has not yet learned where the limit is, or who believes perhaps that ambition and precision are sufficient substitutes for caution. The foundation beneath the Bent Pyramid compounded the problem in ways that may not have been fully understood when construction began. Earlier monuments, including the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, were built on firm limestone bedrock, the kind of compacted subsurface that distributes load reliably and resists deformation under pressure. Dashur offered different ground. Surveys of the site have identified that portions of the Bent Pyramid's foundation rest on desert subsoil, less stable, more compressible, and far less predictable under the weight of a structure intended to rise well above 100 metres. As millions of limestone blocks accumulated above it, the subsoil was being asked to do something it was not ideally suited to do: hold still. Inside the pyramid, the structural challenge intensified further. Unlike a solid mass of stone, the Bent Pyramid contained internal corridors and chambers, voids carved into the core to house the burial systems required by Egyptian religious architecture. Those voids, necessary as they were, introduced discontinuities into the structural fabric of the pyramid. Where stone should have been pressing against stone in an unbroken load path, there were instead open spaces, chambers roofed with horizontal slabs, passages cutting laterally through courses that were already managing significant compressive stress. The casing stones on the exterior and the rougher core blocks inside behaved differently under load. That differential, two materials responding to pressure at slightly different rates, created internal tension at the interfaces between them. The pyramid was, in effect, working against itself. None of this was necessarily visible from the outside as construction advanced through its lower courses. The structure rose, the ramps extended, and the workforce hauled stone upward in the quantities that Sneferu's ambitions demanded. The angle held, the profile was clean, the pyramid looked, from any distance, like exactly what it was intended to be. But beneath that surface, pressure was accumulating in the subsoil. Stress was concentrating around the internal voids, and the lateral thrust of 54 degrees was loading the lower courses with forces that had no safe outlet. The pyramid was rising rapidly, far too rapidly. Stone does not fail silently. Before a structure reaches the point of visible collapse, it communicates. It shifts minutely under loads it was not designed to carry. It opens hairline fractures along stress paths that engineers, if they are paying close attention, can read like a warning written in the material itself. And the language is subtle: a crack where the wall meets the ceiling, a slight displacement in a door lintel, a passage that no longer reads as perfectly plumb, but it is legible provided someone is looking. At the bent pyramid, someone was looking. Modern structural surveys of the pyramid's interior have produced findings that reframe the entire monument. Inside the lower chambers, investigators have identified stress fractures, cracks that form not from age or seismic activity after the fact, but from compressive forces generated during or shortly after construction. The internal passages show compression damage consistent with a structure absorbing lateral loads beyond the tolerance of its design. The chamber walls carry the marks of stone that was being asked to hold more than it could safely contain. These are not the signs of a building that failed gradually over millennia. They are the signatures of a crisis that developed while the pyramid was still being actively built, while ramps were still in use, while workers were still hauling stone to courses that had not yet been laid. The pyramid was showing its distress from the inside out. Reconstructing what the engineers encountered requires grounding speculation in what the physical evidence actually supports, and the evidence supports this sequence clearly enough to follow. The internal chambers of the bent pyramid were not inspected once and abandoned. Egyptian builders maintained access to lower passages throughout construction, both for ritual purposes and for the practical reason that any instability in the burial chambers would compromise the entire monument's function. But these were not men who built upward and never looked back. Records from comparable construction projects of this era describe teams of specialised workers, distinct from the labourers hauling stone, whose role involved inspecting and maintaining the structural integrity of internal spaces. At Dashur, those inspectors would have been moving through corridors that were, at the pyramid's lower levels, already under the full compressive weights of the courses above them. What they found in those corridors changed the trajectory of the entire project. The fractures would not have appeared all at once. Structural failure at this scale announces itself incrementally. First, a crack along a ceiling joint, the kind that a careful eye notices and a less careful one dismisses as settling. Then a second, at a different point in the same chamber, show running in a direction that confirms the first was not incidental. Then the more alarming evidence: displacement. Stone that has moved fractionally but measurably from where it was placed at 54 degrees and rising toward its intended apex. The bent pyramid was generating lateral thrust that the subsoil beneath it could not fully absorb, and the internal chamber system could not safely accommodate. The forces pressing outward through the lower courses had nowhere to resolve except into the stone itself. The pyramid was not collapsing, but it was moving toward collapse along a path that the engineers, if they understood what they were seeing, could not ignore. And the evidence suggests they understood it precisely. And at approximately 49 metres above the base, roughly halfway to the pyramid's originally intended height, construction stopped as it had been proceeding and restarted under a fundamentally different set of rules. The angle was reduced from 54 degrees to 43 degrees. That single decision altered the load on the lower structure more significantly than any other intervention available to builders without modern materials or machinery. A shallower upper section meant less weight pressing outward against courses that were already stressed. It meant the pyramid could continue rising without compounding the crisis unfolding beneath it. The visual result, that unmistakable bend in the profile, was incidental. The engineering result was survival. This was not a refinement or a stylistic adjustment. It was one of the earliest known large-scale architectural redesigns in recorded history, a decision made under pressure, in real time, with everything at stake. The pyramid would not fall. But the work of saving it had only just begun. Changing the angle of a pyramid mid-construction is not a small decision. It is not the ancient equivalent of adjusting a blueprint in an office. By the time the builders at Dahshur made their intervention, the lower half of the structure already existed, millions of limestone blocks already set, already bearing load, already locked into the geometry of 54 degrees. The ramps had been built to serve that angle. The workforce had been organised around it. The entire logistical apparatus of the construction site was calibrated to a trajectory that was now being abandoned. To change course at 49 metres required not just a new plan, but a complete reconfiguration of how the upper pyramid would be built, while the lower pyramid continued to absorb forces that had already proven dangerous. What the engineers achieved in that reconfiguration is, by any measure, remarkable. The mathematics of the correction were precise and deliberate. At 54 degrees, a pyramid generates substantial lateral thrust, force pressing outward through the lower courses and into the foundation. The steeper the angle, the more the structure's weight resolves horizontally rather than vertically, and the greater the stress on everything below. Reducing the angle to 43 degrees fundamentally changed that equation. A shallower upper section is, by definition, lighter relative to its footprint, and it places less total mass above the already stressed lower courses. More critically, it redirects the force vectors of that mass, pressing more directly downward rather than outward, reducing the lateral load on foundations that had already demonstrated their limitations. The lower structure did not change, but the demands being made of it changed significantly. That redistribution of pressure, achieved through geometry alone, without any material stronger than limestone, was the intervention that allowed the pyramid to survive. The visual consequence of that decision is the feature that has defined this monument for 4,600 years. From a distance, the bend appears almost organic, as though the pyramid shifted naturally, the way a sand dune reshapes under wind. Up close, the transition is sharper, as the lower courses rise at their original aggressive angle, and then, at a precise horizontal line, roughly halfway up the face, the incline steps back. The upper section continues on a gentler trajectory, its silhouette noticeably less steep than the base that supports it. It is, structurally speaking, two pyramids, one stacked atop the other, joined at the point where fear overrode ambition. Inside the upper section of the pyramid, the engineering response went further than the angle correction alone. The upper burial chamber was constructed with a corbelled ceiling, a technique in which each successive course of stone projects slightly inward over the one below it, creating a vault that steps upward in overlapping layers rather than spanning the space with a single horizontal slab. And the effect distributes the weight of the stone above the chamber outward and downward along the chamber walls, rather than concentrating it across a flat ceiling that would be vulnerable to exactly the kind of compressive failure the lower chambers had already experienced. This was not decorative architecture. It was a direct structural response to a demonstrated problem, an innovation developed under pressure and applied immediately in the same building where the problem had first appeared. Layers of stone in that corbelled ceiling represent something more than construction technique. They represent accumulated knowledge, built course by course into the fabric of the monument itself. That knowledge did not stay at Dashur. The corbelling technique, the angle calculations, yet the understanding of how lateral thrust behaves at monumental scale, all of it would travel forward in time, refined by subsequent builders who inherited the lessons this pyramid had generated at such cost. The bent pyramid was no longer simply a monument under construction. It had become something the ancient world had no specific word for, a laboratory, a place where the boundaries of structural engineering were being discovered, tested and recorded, not in papyrus, but in stone. The question was whether the structure being built around those discoveries would hold long enough for the lessons to survive. The most important question about the bent pyramid is not why it bends. It is whether the bend worked. 4,600 years have now passed since those engineers made their decision at 49 metres. So the subsoil beneath the structure has continued bearing its load through every season, every seismic tremor, every century of exposure to one of the most demanding climates on Earth. The internal chambers, the ones that showed fractures and compression damage while construction was still underway, have been sitting under the full weight of the completed structure for longer than most civilizations have existed. The answer the pyramid gives, simply by standing, is unambiguous. It worked. Modern structural surveys of the bent pyramid have produced findings that go beyond confirming its stability. They reveal, with a precision that ancient builders could not have anticipated, exactly how well their intervention performed. The stress fractures identified in the lower chambers did not propagate after construction was completed. The damage that was present when the angle was changed remained contained. It did not advance into the surrounding stonework or compromise the load-bearing capacity of the lower structure. The redistribution of pressure achieved by reducing the angle to 43 degrees was sufficient to stabilize the forces that had been pushing the pyramid toward failure. The intervention, in engineering terms, was not merely adequate, it was correct. What makes the bent pyramid's survival particularly striking is the context it sits within. Egyptian pyramid construction produced failures, significant ones. The evidence at Meidum, that tower of exposed core rising from a field of its own collapsed casing, is the most dramatic example, but it is not the only one. Other structures from this era show signs of compromise, subsidence, and partial collapse of outer casing, internal chambers that did not survive intact. The ambition that drove pyramid construction in the 4th dynasty regularly outpaced the structural knowledge available to support it. Against that backdrop, the bent pyramid's survival is not incidental. It is the direct result of a specific decision made at a specific moment, and the contrast with monuments that were not corrected in time makes that decision look, across the distance of 4,600 years, like exactly the right one. There is one further detail about the bent pyramid's condition that separates it from nearly every other monument of its age. Its original casing stones are still present. Most pyramids, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, lost their smooth outer limestone facing long ago, stripped away in later centuries for use in other construction projects. What remains of those pyramids is the rougher core structure beneath, exposed and stepped, its original surface geometry gone. The bent pyramid retains much of its casing. The polished limestone that Sneferu's workers laid against the outer face of the structure remains in place across significant portions of the monument, giving it a surface continuity that the pyramids at Giza no longer possess. Standing at Dahshur, you are looking at something closer to what these monuments actually looked like when they were built. The reflective, carefully dressed exterior that turned them into geometric objects of almost supernatural precision. That survival is not unrelated to the engineering story. A monument that stabilised early, and that did not suffer progressive structural deterioration, that was not shaken apart by the kind of failures that stripped other pyramids of their casing. That monument kept what others lost. The crisis that bent this pyramid passed somewhere in the decades following its completion. The engineers who redesigned it, the workers who executed that redesign, and the pharaoh who commissioned the entire project did not live to see what 4,600 years would confirm. But the stone recorded the outcome on their behalf. The pyramid that almost collapsed did not collapse. It stands. It holds, it endures, casing intact, geometry preserved, the visible scar of its crisis still written into its profile for anyone who looks long enough to read it. The redesign worked, and the knowledge it produced was about to be put to use. Less than 2 kilometres north of the bent pyramid, still within the Dahshur necropolis, stands a structure that most visitors overlook entirely. It does not have the dramatic profile of its neighbour. It does not carry a visible scar or an immediately arresting irregularity. It rises at a single, consistent angle from its base to its apex, clean, stable, and geometrically resolved. In photographs, it photographs as a lesser monument. In the history of architecture, it is one of the most significant structures ever built. It is called the Red Pyramid, named for the reddish hue of its core limestone, exposed across its surface after its own outer casing was stripped in later centuries, and it was built by the same pharaoh on the same plateau within the same reign as the pyramid that nearly fell beside it. Sneferu built the Red Pyramid after Dahshur had taught him what he needed to know. The number that defines the Red Pyramid is 43 degrees, not at the base, and a different number halfway up. Not as a correction applied under duress, after the structure showed signs of distress. 43 degrees from the first course of stone to the capstone, consistent, uninterrupted, and deliberate. That angle was not arrived at theoretically. It was not calculated in advance by engineers who had worked out the structural mathematics from first principles. It was chosen because the bent pyramid had already demonstrated at enormous cost and considerable risk that 54 degrees was unsustainable and 43 degrees was survivable. The Red Pyramid did not discover that angle, it inherited it, whilst the internal architecture of the Red Pyramid reflects the same inheritance. Its burial chambers were constructed using the corbelled ceiling technique developed under crisis conditions in the bent pyramid's upper section, each course of stone stepping inward over the one below it, distributing load along the chamber walls rather than concentrating it across a vulnerable horizontal span. At Dahshur, that technique had been an emergency measure. In the Red Pyramid, it was standard practice, applied from the outset with the confidence of builders who already knew it worked. The chambers have remained structurally intact, no compression damage, no stress fractures propagating through the surrounding masonry, no evidence of the kind of internal distress that the bent pyramid's lower corridors still carry in their walls. As the Red Pyramid is not a more cautious version of the bent pyramid. It is a more informed one, a structure built by people who had already run the experiment and were now executing the results. This is the moment where the interpretation of the bent pyramid shifts entirely. Throughout its history, the bent pyramid has been read as a monument of compromise, a pyramid that could not become what it was intended to be, and had to settle for something lesser. That reading misunderstands the relationship between the two structures at Dahshur. The bent pyramid was not a failed attempt at the Red Pyramid. The Red Pyramid was the bent pyramid's direct consequence, the structure that became possible only because its predecessor had absorbed the risk, revealed the limits, and generated the knowledge that a successful smooth-sided pyramid actually required. Without the crisis at 49 metres, there is no confident 43-degree baseline. Without the corbelled emergency in the upper chamber, there is no refined corbelling in the burial halls of the Red Pyramid. Without the bent pyramid's near failure, the Red Pyramid has no foundation in understanding to stand on. The bent pyramid was not a prototype in the dismissive sense of that word, a rough draft, an early attempt to be discarded once the real version arrived. It was a prototype in the most precise sense, the structure through which the knowledge necessary for success was generated and proven. And that knowledge did not stop at the Red Pyramid. It travelled north, across the desert, across one generation, to a plateau above the Nile, where Sneferu's son was already planning something that would exceed everything his father had built. The road to Giza ran directly through Dahshur. Knowledge, in the ancient world, did not travel in books. It travelled in people, in the master builders, the overseers, the specialised inspectors, who had stood inside fracturing corridors and watched stone shift under loads it could not safely carry. It travelled in the decisions those people made, the techniques they developed under pressure, and the institutional memory of a construction program that had run continuously across an entire reign. When Sneferu died and his son Khufu inherited the throne, yet he also inherited something that no previous pharaoh had possessed, a generation of builders who had already encountered the limits of monumental construction and come back from them. That inheritance would produce the most precisely built structure in the ancient world. The Great Pyramid of Giza rises at 51.5 degrees, a figure that sits between the dangerous ambition of Dahshur's original 54 and the cautious correction of 43. It is not the shallowest angle available to Khufu's engineers. It is the steepest angle they could justify with confidence, given everything the Dahshur experience had demonstrated about lateral thrust, foundation behaviour, and the relationship between slope and structural stress. That number was not guesswork. It was calibrated, the product of builders who understood, with hard-won precision, where the margins of safety actually lay. The foundation at Giza was prepared accordingly. Unlike the desert subsoil beneath the bent pyramid, the Giza plateau offered solid limestone bedrock, a base capable of distributing the load of 2.5 million stone blocks without the compressive instability that had threatened Dashur from beneath. Chronologies of the site indicate that the bedrock was levelled and prepared with extraordinary care before a single course of the pyramid was laid. The engineers at Giza were not leaving foundation stability to chance. Dashur had shown them exactly what happened when they did. Inside the Great Pyramid, the influence of the Dashur experience is structural and specific. So at the Grand Gallery, a corbelled ascending corridor running through the pyramid's interior employs the same fundamental principle developed in the bent pyramid's upper chamber. Successive courses of stone stepping inward to distribute load away from a central void. At Dashur, that technique had been applied hastily under crisis conditions to prevent a chamber ceiling from failing. At Giza, it was executed with a refinement and scale that transformed a structural necessity into one of the most impressive interior spaces of the ancient world. The stress-relieving chambers above the king's chamber, 5 horizontal spaces stacked above the burial room to distribute the weight of the pyramid above it, represent the same logic carried further. The problem of protecting an internal void from compressive failure, first encountered seriously at Dashur, was solved at Giza with a sophistication that required knowing precisely what the problem was. That knowledge came from Sneferu's building program. It could not have come from anywhere else. The Great Pyramid's most celebrated achievement is its geometric precision. Right angles accurate to fractions of a degree. Sides aligned to the cardinal points with a consistency that modern engineers regard with genuine respect. That precision is real, and it is extraordinary. But precision of that order is only achievable when the underlying structural confidence is already in place. You do not chase millimetre level accuracy when you are uncertain whether your foundation will hold or your chambers will fracture. You chase it when the fundamental engineering problems have already been solved. At Giza, they had been solved. At Dashur, they had been lived through. The perfection of the Great Pyramid is not separate from the crisis of the Bent Pyramid. It is downstream of it, built on the same foundation of hard knowledge, inherited from the same generation of builders, shaped by the same near disaster that bent a pyramid's profile against the Egyptian sky and refused, against considerable odds, to let it fall. Khufu's monument broke every record the ancient world had seen. It did so because his father's monument had broken first. Stand at Dashur on a clear morning and look at the bent pyramid long enough, and something shifts in how you see it. The bend stops looking like a flaw. It stops looking like a correction. It starts looking like what it actually is: evidence, physical, permanent, of 4,600-year-old evidence of a civilization in the act of thinking, not performing, not decorating, not following a ritual script laid down by tradition, thinking in the hard, consequential way that only becomes necessary when the stakes are real and the margin for error has run out. What the bent pyramid reveals about ancient Egypt is more surprising and more important than the structural crisis that shaped it. The first thing it reveals is that the ancient Egyptians were iterative engineers. That word, iterative, carries specific meaning. It does not simply mean they tried things. It means they tried things, evaluated the results, incorporated what they learned, and tried again at a higher level of understanding. Yet the sequence from the step pyramid to the Maidum structure, to the bent pyramid, to the red pyramid, to the Great Pyramid, is not a linear march toward inevitable perfection. It is a feedback loop, each monument informed by the successes and failures of its predecessor, each generation of builders working from a richer body of knowledge than the one before it. That is not the image most people carry of ancient Egypt. The popular conception tends toward the monolithic, a civilization of absolute certainty, building to divine specifications handed down from above, executing rather than experimenting. The bent pyramid dismantles that image entirely. The second thing it reveals is that Egyptian builders were actively monitoring structural behaviour during construction. The crisis at Dahshur was not discovered after the fact. The fractures in the lower chambers, the compression damage in the passages, these were identified while the pyramid was still being built, while intervention was still possible. That implies a practice of systematic inspection, a methodology for reading structural distress, and a willingness to act on what that inspection revealed, even when acting meant abandoning a design that represented years of work and an enormous investment of national resources. Risk management, in other words, at monumental scale. In the 3rd millennium BC, the third revelation is perhaps the most consequential. The bent pyramid demonstrates that ancient Egyptian construction was not simply an exercise in applying known techniques to known problems. It was, at its frontier, an exercise in discovering what the problems actually were. The builders at Dahshur did not know in advance that 54 degrees was unsustainable on that foundation. They found out by building, and when the building told them something they had not anticipated, they listened. That capacity for institutional learning, the ability of a complex ancient state to absorb a crisis, extract its lessons, and transmit those lessons forward into subsequent projects, is, in some respects, more impressive than any individual technical achievement the pyramids represent. Stone can be moved by sufficient human effort. Knowledge has to be generated, recognized, preserved, and applied. The evidence at Dahshur, at the Red Pyramid, and at Giza suggests that the Egyptians were doing all four. The bend in the bent pyramid is not an imperfection, and it is the most honest feature of any monument in Egypt. A place where the structure stopped pretending and started responding, where the ambition of the design gave way to the reality of the material, and where the engineers made the only decision that the situation actually permitted. It is frozen evidence of thought, the visible scar of learning pressed into limestone and left standing through 46 centuries of history. Every smooth-sided pyramid that followed it, every clean angle, every stable chamber, every precisely resolved geometry, carries the memory of that bend in its foundations, whether the stones that form it know it or not. The pyramid that almost collapsed became the blueprint for everything that didn't.